They didn't begin as legends. They began as two young people in a country that felt like it was collapsing from the inside out, where money evaporated, jobs vanished, and the future looked like a locked door no one would open. In the early years of the Great Depression, America was full of empty pockets and crowded fears. Men rode freight trains looking for work. Families salted away pennies like treasure. Banks failed, and with them failed the belief that honest effort guaranteed safety. In that kind of world, crime didn't just exist on the margins. It sat right there on the kitchen table next to the unpaid bills. And when Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow found each other, it wasn't simply romance that sparked. It was the feeling that they were both too alive to accept a small life, too proud to bow their heads, too restless to stand still while the world told them they were nothing. Bonnie was sharp, expressive, hungry for meaning. She liked words. She liked the idea of being remembered. She was the type who could make a boring room feel electric just by being in it, the type who could turn a glance into a promise. Clyde was different, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, intense in a way that wasn't gentle. He carried the anger of poverty, the humiliation of being looked down on, and the stubborn belief that if the world could take from him without mercy, then he had the right to take back. Before Bonnie, Clyde had already been sliding into theft and petty crime, not as some romantic rebellion but as a path that opened when lawful paths closed. It started like it often does. Small burglaries, stealing cars, quick hustles, the kind of crimes that feel temporary when you're young because you can still pretend you'll stop later. But later requires an exit, and Clyde's exit got sealed when he went to prison. Prison didn't reform Clyde. It forged him into something harder. It taught him that power isn't abstract. It's a man with keys, a man with fists, a system that can grind you down until you stop feeling like a person. What happened to him behind bars became a core wound. He left with a kind of oath that sat inside his chest like a blade. Never again. Never again to be trapped, ordered, humiliated, made small. This wasn't just a preference. It became a fixation. In the story that followed, money mattered, but not as much as movement. Safety mattered, but not as much as freedom. And when you build your entire identity around never being captured again, every police car becomes an existential threat, every traffic stop becomes a potential grave, every siren becomes a trigger that can flip your mind into fight or die. When Bonnie and Clyde met, their connection lit fast because they offered each other something the world didn't. To Clyde, Bonnie was loyalty and excitement, a partner who didn't flinch from danger and who made him feel seen as more than a poor Texas boy doomed to fail. To Bonnie, Clyde was motion and intensity, the doorway to a life that felt larger than the one she'd been handed. It wasn't long before she was pulled fully into his orbit. And once she was in, the road began to close behind them. Not immediately. Not all at once. But with each theft, each robbery, each escape, the idea of returning to normal life became less realistic, like trying to swim back upstream after you've already gone over the falls. The earliest phase of their spree rarely resembled the grand bank robbery legends that later bloomed in newspapers and movies. It was more raw and practical. Stolen cars like oxygen, small cash grabs to keep going, roadside crimes that were fast and ugly rather than epic. If you want to understand Bonnie and Clyde truly, you have to picture them not as glamorous celebrities but as fugitives who needed gas, food, ammunition, and somewhere to sleep. The targets were often the kinds of places that dotted rural America: small stores, gas stations, cafes, any spot where a gun and a few harsh words could pry open a drawer and buy them another day. These were the crimes that don't become folklore because they are too common, too humiliating for the victims, too small in profit to sound cinematic. But they were the daily bread of the spree. And they mattered, because each one was a step deeper into risk, deeper into desperation, deeper into the logic of violence. Robbery changes you, even if you don't fire a shot. The first time you point a gun at someone's face, you see their humanity up close. You see their fear. Their hands shake. Their eyes search for mercy that may not exist. And you realize you are now the kind of person who can do this. If you have any softness left, it screams at you. If you don't, you feel powerful. Clyde liked power. It made him feel safe. The road rewarded that sensation, because the road is cruel. A criminal who hesitates can be caught. A criminal who hesitates can be killed. A criminal who hesitates can end up back in a cell. So on the road, hesitation becomes a weakness you cut out of yourself like rot. It wasn't long before theft and robbery began to blend into something more serious for the gang. Carjackings and forced rides. People imagine the 1930s as a simpler time, but one thing was already modern: mobility. A car was freedom in metal form, and Clyde understood that better than most. The gang needed wheels constantly. A stolen car would heat up quickly, the license plates would be broadcast, the model would be recognized, the description would spread from town to town. So they stole again and again, switching vehicles like changing masks. Sometimes they stole cars while owners were inside a store. Sometimes they confronted people directly, taking vehicles at gunpoint. And sometimes they did something that later became infamous. They took the driver too, forcing civilians to ride with them as a temporary shield and a temporary guarantee. In those moments, the victims were not in some romantic outlaw story. They were hostages in a moving coffin, listening to strangers argue about routes while the road blurred past the windows. The gang sometimes tried to manage these victims with a strange performance of manners, telling them they wouldn't be harmed if they complied, sometimes even joking, sometimes acting like it was all a misunderstanding. But the gun did the real talking. Politeness under threat is not kindness. It's control. As their offenses stacked up, law enforcement attention sharpened. At first, small-town officers might treat a robbery like just another case. But when patterns emerged, similar descriptions, similar weapons, similar methods, investigators began piecing it together. The real nightmare for Bonnie and Clyde wasn't some genius detective. It was simple recognition. A clerk who had seen their photo. A deputy who had read a bulletin. A passerby who noticed the wrong license plate. And at this stage, the most dangerous thing in their world became the ordinary traffic stop. A traffic stop is intimate. It brings strangers to arm's length. It brings questions that require answers. It brings the risk of hands on your body, of cuffs clicking shut, of numbers called in on a radio, of the whole fragile structure of your escape collapsing in a minute. Clyde feared that collapse like he feared nothing else. Because to Clyde, being caught was not just punishment. It was annihilation of the self. It was being made powerless again. That fear shaped his reactions. When confronted, Clyde's mind didn't move toward surrender. It moved toward immediate escape, and if escape required violence, violence became the price. So the spree escalated. The gang's early phase included armed robberies, burglaries, and massive auto theft across multiple counties and states, crimes that multiplied because movement demanded constant resources. But inevitably, the more you steal and threaten, the more you collide with armed resistance. A store owner might keep a shotgun. A customer might be a veteran. A deputy might be close by. And in one of the early deadly episodes of the spree, violence turned fatal during a robbery. A man died. A family lost a father or a husband in a moment that lasted seconds. And when that happened, the line was crossed, even if some people later tried to pretend it wasn't. From there, law enforcement encounters grew more frequent and more lethal. The gang was not a stable organization with disciplined rules. It was a volatile cluster of young criminals influenced by Clyde's intensity. Different associates came and went. Some were loyal. Some were reckless. Some were terrified kids playing outlaw until they realized the game involved bullets. But the constant was Clyde's leadership and Bonnie's devotion. Together, they weren't just committing crimes, they were building an identity. Fugitives who would not be caged. And the media poured fuel on that identity. Once newspapers realized there was a young woman on the run, the story transformed. A gunman was common. A gunwoman was irresistible. Reporters and editors wrote about Bonnie with a tone that swung between fascination and moral outrage. Her face, her posture, her youth, all of it became part of a narrative. People began projecting fantasies onto her. That she was a kidnapped innocent, that she was the mastermind, that she was a villain, that she was a victim. The truth was harsher. She was a participant in a spree that terrified ordinary people, a partner in a life where even small mistakes could end in death. And then there was the element that made everything irreversible. The killing of lawmen. Once an officer dies in the line of duty, the nature of pursuit changes. It becomes less like policing and more like war. Even if the gang didn't wake up planning to kill a deputy on a given morning, the very structure of their life made deadly confrontation more likely each week. A deputy recognizes them and reaches for his weapon. Clyde sees the movement and fires. Or an officer tries to take them in, and Bonnie and Clyde panic because panic is the default state of someone who cannot afford capture. Whatever the exact seconds looked like, the result was the same. Uniformed men died, and the state's response hardened into something relentless. By late 1932, the spree had gathered real blood and real momentum. Robberies continued. Car thefts continued. Kidnappings for escape continued. And the gang's reputation began morphing from robbers to public enemies. Every successful escape made them bolder, but it also made the net tighter. Because every escape taught law enforcement something. How they moved, what types of roads they preferred, what kind of targets they liked, how quickly they reacted when confronted. It was a grim evolutionary process, predator and prey adapting to each other, except here the prey was armed and violent, capable of turning on the hunters in an instant. At the same time, life on the road was stripping away their humanity in small ways. They didn't live with stability. They lived with constant pressure. That pressure turns affection into dependence. It turns love into a pact. It turns every conversation into tactics. Where to go, who to trust, what to do if they're surrounded. It turns feelings into survival tools. For Bonnie and Clyde, romance existed, but it was wrapped in fear. And fear changes the shape of everything. They learned to avoid big cities and favor rural routes because rural roads gave them options. They learned to keep weapons within reach at all times. They learned to rely on stolen cars not just as transportation but as armor, an object that could carry them across a border where one county sheriff's authority ended and another's began. They learned, most of all, that the United States of the 1930s was a patchwork of jurisdictions, and if you could move fast enough, you could outrun coordination, at least for a while. But for a while is the key phrase. Because even in the early stage, the tension was building towards something larger. Clyde wasn't only robbing for money. He was collecting a kind of score with the state. He carried rage toward the prison system that had scarred him, and that rage was not going to stay passive. It would evolve. It would become purposeful. And when it did, the spree would stop being merely a sequence of robberies and become an all-out escalation that forced authorities to adapt in ways they hadn't before. So as this first block ends, picture them not yet at the final cliff, but already running along its edge. They are committing the core crimes that define the beginning of the Bonnie and Clyde saga. Repeated auto theft across multiple states, armed robberies, especially of small businesses and occasional banks kidnappings and forced rides of civilians to facilitate escape, and the earliest lethal clashes that turn their flight into a serious manhunt. They are becoming famous at the exact moment fame becomes a trap. They are becoming more confident at the exact moment the net begins to tighten. And the road ahead is about to get harsher, because the next stage brings not just more robberies, but larger violence, bigger coordination against them, and the act that will pour gasoline on Clyde's hatred and make the hunt personal for an entire state. The second block begins with a truth that most legends try to hide. Once the country knows your name, your freedom starts shrinking by the hour. Fame sounds like power, but for fugitives it's poison. It means every gas station clerk has seen your face on a poster. It means every diner has a man who reads the paper slowly and looks up at strangers too long. It means every sheriff's deputy knows the make of the car you like to steal, the weapons you carry, and the kind of road you prefer when you're trying to vanish. Bonnie and Clyde, by this point, were no longer just slipping through cracks in the system. They were being hunted through those cracks, chased by men who had started thinking less about arrest warrants and more about funerals. They kept moving anyway, because movement was the only form of safety that still existed for them. The rhythm grew more brutal and more efficient. Steal a car, run it until it's too risky, dump it, take another hit a small store because it's fast hit a bank when the opportunity looks clean, take cash, ammo, food, then disappear before anyone can build a perimeter. It's easy to imagine robberies as dramatic, but most of theirs were quick, tense bursts of terror, 2 minutes of commands, a gun leveled at a face, a drawer emptied, a warning hissed through clenched teeth. Bonnie's presence complicated everything. A woman in the gang made witnesses remember details more clearly, made newspapers write more aggressively, made the public more obsessed. That obsession acted like a magnifying glass. Wherever they went, the heat followed. And the heat didn't only come from cops. It came from desperation. Their own desperation. Their injuries, exhaustion, paranoia. Because the road grinds you down in ways Hollywood never shows. Your nerves never reset. Your sleep never becomes deep. Your stomach never feels settled because you never know if the next meal is your last car moment. You begin to live in the minute-to-minute logic of survival. What's the fastest way out of this building? Who is watching our car? What if the engine stalls? What if the clerk reaches under the counter? What if that man outside is memorizing our faces? Under that kind of constant stress, decision-making becomes harsher. You stop negotiating with the world. You start forcing the world to move around you. This is the stage where their crimes broaden and stack up rapidly, and where the gang's methods reveal what they truly valued. Not riches, but momentum. Their list of offenses expands in the most practical, relentless way possible. Car theft becomes almost routine, because they can't keep one vehicle for long without risking identification. Armed robberies multiply, because they need cash for food, rooms, ammunition, and to keep bribing or buying their way through small needs. Bank robberies happen too, but often they prefer smaller targets because smaller targets are quicker, less protected, less likely to trigger an immediate, coordinated pursuit. The public, however, loves the word bank, so the myth grows. People imagine huge hauls, grand outlaw drama. The truth is uglier. Much of what Bonnie and Clyde did was the violent scavenging of fugitives trying to stay alive. They also continued something that made civilians fear them in a very personal way. Forced kidnappings and borrowed rides. If they needed a car and the easiest way was to take the driver with it, so the driver couldn't immediately run to the nearest phone, so the driver's panic could be controlled, they did it. A victim might be ordered into the backseat, told to keep their head down, told they'd live if they stayed calm. Sometimes the gang would release kidnapped victims far from where they'd started, leaving them shaken and stranded. Those victims carried the story into living rooms and cafes. The smell of the gun oil, the flat tone of Clyde's voice, the way Bonnie watched, the way time slowed when you realized your life depended on the mood of strangers. And as those stories spread, law enforcement tactics began shifting. Officers stopped thinking of Bonnie and Clyde as ordinary criminals. They started treating them as armed fugitives likely to kill, likely to fight, likely to escape at high speed. That perception matters, because it changes everything about a confrontation. A patrolman who thinks as stopping a thief might approach with routine caution. A patrolman who thinks as stopping killers approaches with a hand already near the weapon, with tension already in the shoulders, with fear already in the breathing. That fear can trigger gunfire in a second. It can turn pullover into shoot. This is also the stage where Clyde's psychological pressure cooker begins to drive him toward escalation beyond robbery. His hatred of the prison system, the memory of being trapped, humiliated, brutalized, doesn't fade on the road. It grows. Each time he sees a uniform, it doesn't only mean capture. It means his past. It means the old nightmare reaching out to drag him back. And because he is a man who believes he must never be powerless again, he begins to behave like someone at war, not only running, but striking. The gang's membership shifts around this time. Associates come and go, and the group's volatility becomes part of the danger. Some of the younger men around Clyde are impulsive, eager to prove themselves, quick to panic. Panic is deadly in a gunfight. Panic produces accidents, reckless shots, rash decisions that kill people who never needed to die. Clyde tries to control the chaos, but he can't fully. The road doesn't allow full control. Events happen too fast. Law enforcement starts capturing scraps, abandoned cars, stolen plates, witness statements, patterns of travel. The chase becomes more coordinated, even across state lines. This is still early 1930s America, not a modern surveillance state, but it's not blind either. Radios exist. Bulletins travel. Departments share information. And the more Bonnie and Clyde cross borders, the more agencies take personal interest. A crime spree doesn't stay local when it keeps spilling into new jurisdictions. It becomes a regional headache. Then a national story. Then a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, because once you become a symbol, you stop being a person in the eyes of the authorities. You become a problem that must be solved. During this period, the gang is linked to repeated thefts, robberies, kidnappings, and violent confrontations, and the confrontations increasingly end with bodies. Each killing deepens the determination of law enforcement. Each killing turns the next encounter more lethal. It's a grim feedback loop. The gang shoots because they fear capture, police approach harder because they fear being shot harder, approaches increase the chance of gunfire, gunfire increases the death count increases the intensity of the hunt. The road becomes a corridor lined with weapons on both sides. Meanwhile, the public fascination grows into something sick and hungry. People don't just read about Bonnie and Clyde, they argue about them. In barbershops and kitchens, some insist they're monsters, others insist they're victims of the Depression, Others romanticize them as lovers against the world. But the victims, the robbed clerks, the kidnapped motorists, the wounded officers, don't live in romance. They live in trauma. And for many lawmen, the story stops being about law and starts being about revenge, about protecting their own, about stopping two young people from turning every quiet road into a potential crime scene. As the second block closes, Bonnie and Clyde are still running, still stealing cars like a habit, still robbing for speed rather than wealth, still forcing civilians into moments of terror, and still colliding with law enforcement in ways that are becoming more violent and more fatal. Their fame is now a trap that follows them into every town. Their network of help is becoming riskier because police are watching families and associates more closely. Their margin for error is shrinking. And Clyde's anger is evolving from "I won't be caught" into something more aggressive, an obsession with striking back at the prison system itself, with reshaping his crew, with turning his flight into a campaign. They don't fully realize it yet, but by now the ending is already being built mile by mile. Because the next stage won't simply be more robberies. The next stage will include the act that intensifies everything, an escalation that humiliates authorities, spills more blood, and convinces the state that the only acceptable ending is a final, decisive ambush. The third block begins with the moment the road stops feeling like an adventure and starts feeling like a curse. Not because the cops are closer, though they are, but because the fugitives themselves are breaking down. The human body was never designed for a life lived half awake, cramped in stolen cars, eating when you can, sleeping in bursts, and waking up every time gravel shifts outside a motel door. That kind of existence scrapes the nerves raw. It turns love into dependence, courage into recklessness, and caution into paranoia. And then, in a twist that feels almost cruel in how ordinary it is, disaster hits them not in a shootout, but in a violent crash, an accident that leaves Bonnie with severe injuries that change everything. From that point on, their spree takes on a darker quality, because pain becomes a constant passenger. Bonnie isn't just tired or scared. She's wounded in a way that doesn't neatly heal on the run. Movement becomes harder. Hiding becomes harder. Every hurried escape becomes a gamble. If she can't run properly, then every encounter with police becomes exponentially more dangerous. If she can't move fast, then Clyde has to plan around her limitations. And yet, even then, they do not surrender. That decision, continuing while physically broken, tells you exactly how trapped they feel. By now, they aren't running toward freedom. They're running away from a fate they cannot imagine surviving. Capture, prison, separation, humiliation, the slow death of identity behind bars. This is where Clyde's mindset shifts from reactive violence to strategic escalation. He isn't satisfied with simply evading the law. He is furious at the very system chasing him. The prison experience that scarred him isn't a memory anymore, it's a motive. He starts thinking about revenge not as an emotion but as an action plan. And the most explosive expression of that plan is his willingness to attack the prison system directly by freeing inmates and rebuilding his circle with men he trusts, men who are already committed to violence, already comfortable with the idea of killing to stay free. If earlier he moved with a loose crew, now he begins shaping something more purposeful. A tighter, more dangerous unit built around shared hatred and shared risk. That's how the spree stops being only a sequence of robberies and becomes an escalation that embarrasses authorities. The prison break, planned, executed, and soaked in violence, becomes one of the central turning points of the whole saga. It is an attack on the state's pride. Guards are overpowered. Authorities are humiliated. Violence erupts in close quarters where every scream echoes. And the moment it happens, the manhunt transforms. This is no longer a chase for thieves. This becomes a crusade to put down fugitives who are capable of striking institutions, not just robbing storefronts. The consequences are immediate. Law enforcement pressure multiplies. Investigators begin coordinating more aggressively, treating the pursuit like a multi-state hunt requiring special tactics. Phones and radios buzz with updates. Descriptions become sharper. Officers become jumpier. Roadblocks become more serious. There's less assumption that Bonnie and Clyde can be talked down. There's more assumption that they will shoot first. And that assumption, again, increases the likelihood that every meeting ends in gunfire. Meanwhile, the crimes do not stop. They can't stop. They need vehicles. They need cash. They need food and ammunition. They need places to rest. And because their network is unstable, friends and relatives can be watched, threatened, pressured, they rely increasingly on quick hits. The robberies continue. Small businesses, banks when possible, any target that offers a fast payout. Each robbery is now wrapped in higher stakes because the gang is more notorious than ever. Witnesses are more alert. Towns are more wary. There's more chance someone recognizes them instantly. And recognition means bullets or handcuffs within minutes. In this phase, you also see how the gang's internal dynamics become harder and more dangerous. New members and associates, some younger, some more violent, enter the picture, and with them come unpredictable behavior. The road doesn't create discipline. It creates volatility. People argue. People take risks to prove themselves. People panic. And panic, in a firefight, is fatal. A shouted command becomes a gunshot. A gunshot becomes a dead officer. A dead officer turns the next posse into something angrier, better armed, more determined to kill. Bonnie and Clyde also keep using the tactics that made them feared by civilians. Taking cars from ordinary people and, when necessary, taking people too. These forced rides aren't just incidents anymore, they are tools. Tools for escape, tools for buying time, tools for preventing immediate pursuit. A civilian might be held for hours, ordered not to scream, ordered not to look. A person's entire life can split into before and after because a couple wanted their car and didn't have time to negotiate. Sometimes victims lived. Sometimes victims were bruised, robbed, and released. But every victim learned the same truth. These were not storybook outlaws. These were desperate fugitives with guns and a willingness to use them. And then there are the killings, because this stage contains deadly confrontations that cement their status as public enemies beyond any romantic repair. Officers are killed during roadside encounters. Lawmen who approach too close die before they can finish a sentence. In some cases, the violence is sudden and almost mechanical. An officer steps out, hands visible, and seconds later shots are fired because Clyde believes that is his only way back to motion. The killings create shockwaves through small towns where deputies are known personally. Funerals become rallying points. Sheriffs promise they won't rest. The public begins demanding results. This isn't just law enforcement wanting to solve a case, it's communities wanting a threat removed from their roads. And the road itself starts fighting them. Cars break down. Tires blow. Engines overheat. A small mechanical failure can become a life or death event when you're running from an entire region. You can't calmly call a mechanic. You can't wait on the shoulder. You have to improvise. You have to steal again. You have to threaten again. The spree is now self-feeding. Trouble creates urgency. Urgency creates crime. Crime creates heat. Heat creates more trouble. What makes this third block feel especially grim is the sense that Bonnie and Clyde are now running on borrowed time and they know it. Even if they don't say out loud, they understand the net is tightening. They understand that the country is adapting. They understand that their own bodies are failing them. They understand that every success draws more eyes, and every mistake could end them. And still they keep moving, because stopping would mean facing what they've become. Clyde's hatred of prison deepens the hopelessness. He doesn't believe in doing time and starting over. He believes prison is a death of the soul. So he chooses a different kind of death. The quick one, the violent one, the one that happens on the road rather than behind bars. That choice pushes him to be even more aggressive in confrontations, even more committed to keeping weapons close, even more locked into the mindset that survival is won by speed and intimidation. By the end of this block, the spree has reached a brutal maturity. Their crimes now clearly include everything that defines their legend: constant auto theft, repeated armed robbery of stores and banks, kidnappings and forced rides, and escalating lethal violence against law enforcement, culminating in a prison break escalation that enrages the state and turns the pursuit into something specialized and merciless. They are no longer just escaping. They are provoking. They are wounding the system, humiliating it, and daring it to respond. And the system does respond. Quietly, methodically, and with a patience that only vengeance can produce. Because once you embarrass institutions, once you spill enough blood, the law stops behaving like paperwork and starts behaving like a trap. The next block is where that trap begins to close. The fourth block begins when the chase stops being a chase and becomes a calculation. Up to this point, Bonnie and Clyde have survived by improvisation, by speed, by luck, by the ability to vanish a few minutes before a roadblock goes up. But now the people hunting them are learning to think like them. They stop reacting and start predicting. They stop depending on random stops and start building a plan around the only thing every fugitive eventually reveals: habits. Nobody can live on the run without routines, without familiar faces, without a small network of people who feel safe enough to trust. And once law enforcement identifies those routines, those friends, those relatives, those repeated meeting points, the entire manhunt shifts into a quieter, deadlier phase. This is also the stage where the gang circle tightens into something that feels like a final lineup. The members aren't a rotating cast anymore. The crew becomes more defined, and with that definition comes a different kind of danger. Fewer strangers means fewer leaks, but it also means fewer options. Fewer places to hide. Fewer people to rely on when the car breaks down or someone gets sick or hungry. The gang is now traveling with the knowledge that almost any contact could be watched. Every farmhouse could be under surveillance. Every friend could be under pressure. Every relative could be questioned, threatened, followed. And still the fugitives keep reaching back to those contacts, because human beings can't survive indefinitely without some thread to familiarity. Even wolves return to known paths. But the pressure does not loosen. It intensifies. In this phase, the crimes continue with relentless necessity. Car thefts are still constant, because they can't keep one vehicle long without becoming a moving target. Robberies still happen, because fugitives need cash and supplies and ammunition. They can't live on headlines. They live on gasoline. Yet, as their fame grows, each robbery becomes riskier. The moment they enter a store, the odds that someone recognizes them are higher than ever. And recognition is like a match dropped in a room full of fumes. Their relationship with law enforcement also changes in this phase. Earlier, they could sometimes avoid confrontation by choosing quieter targets and slipping away. Now, officers are more aggressive and more prepared. They are not approaching like men expecting a simple surrender. They are approaching like men expecting a shootout. That expectation creates hair-trigger encounters. A deputy who sees a suspicious car might not wait for backup. A patrolman might not walk up politely. A posse might decide to open fire fast rather than give Clyde a chance to react. The manhunt becomes an environment where everyone is afraid and armed, and fear is the fastest path to blood. This is why this stage becomes the deadliest stretch of their spree in terms of encounters on the road. Confrontations happen suddenly, on highways, near bridges, on isolated stretches where there are no witnesses except the trees and the dust. A patrol car appears. Someone signals to pull over. Clyde's body stiffens. His mind flashes to prison bars. His hand moves. Then everything happens at once. Shouting, gunshots, glass shattering, tires screaming. In these moments, there is no myth. There are only terrified men with guns and seconds that decide who walks away. During this phase, additional killings occur in violent encounters with law enforcement, events that further erase any remaining public sympathy and turn the hunt into something that feels inevitable. Communities that once gossiped about romantic outlaws now host funerals. Newspapers that once printed sensational photos now print anger. Officers who once hoped to be the one to arrest them now talk openly about ending them. The public mood shifts from fascination to demand. Stop them, by any means necessary. And as all of this is happening, Bonnie and Clyde are not living in comfort. Bonnie's injuries continue to complicate every move. Imagine trying to be a fugitive when your body can't respond the way it used to. Pain when you step, pain when you sit, pain shifting in the seat of a stolen car while you listen for engines behind you. Imagine Clyde watching her, torn between love and the cold math of survival. Because an injured partner is both a reason to slow down and a reason to become more violent. Slow down and you get caught. Become more violent and you make the system angrier. The road offers no good option. So they do what they've always done. They push forward. They keep stealing cars despite the increasing risk. They keep robbing despite shrinking opportunities. They keep using intimidation on civilians when they need transportation. They keep slipping across state lines, hoping to exploit the seams between jurisdictions. But the seams are closing. The agencies are working together more effectively now, sharing information faster, coordinating to build a full picture of their movements. Lawmen are learning which towns the gang gravitates toward, which backroads they prefer, which individuals might provide shelter or food. This is where the hunt becomes less about speed and more about intelligence. Instead of chasing taillights, authorities start chasing relationships. They focus on the gang's connections, the people who can't simply disappear because they have farms, families, or jobs. The logic is simple. A fugitive can run forever in theory, but in reality, fugitives need rest, need help, need someone to trust. And that need becomes the lever law enforcement uses to tighten the vice. Inside the gang, the psychology turns bleak. Living on the run for that long doesn't just exhaust you. It changes your perception of time. Days blur together. Fear becomes normal. You stop imagining retirement or a peaceful future. Your future becomes a few miles ahead, the next state line, the next place to sleep. Your past becomes the list of crimes you can't undo. Your present becomes a moving car and a hand on a gun. Bonnie and Clyde are also aware they are being pulled toward an ending, even if they refuse to name it. It's in the way they choose roads, in the way they distrust strangers, in the way they rely more on a small circle. It's in the way they keep weapons closer than ever. It's in the way they become more decisive, more brutal in crisis, because uncertainty is the enemy. And then, as the pressure climbs, law enforcement begins shaping what will become the final strategy. Not a risky capture attempt, not a heroic chase, but an ambush designed to prevent escape. They begin thinking in terms of location, timing, and certainty. They understand that any attempt to surround and arrest could end with officers dead and the fugitives slipping away again. They understand Clyde's reflex. If he has a second to move, he will try. If he has a second to shoot, he will. So they build toward a scenario where he has neither. By the end of this fourth block, the entire story has shifted into its last corridor. The crimes have not decreased, they've become more desperate and more dangerous. Auto theft and armed robbery continue as daily necessities. Kidnappings and forced rides remain a tactic for escape. Violent encounters with law enforcement have increased the body count and hardened the response. The gang's network has narrowed, making them more predictable. And police are no longer simply pursuing, they are preparing to end it in one sudden, final burst of violence. The next block is the conclusion. The last days, the final setup, and the end of Bonnie and Clyde on a lonely road, an ending as brutal and definitive as the life they chose. The final block begins with a strange, heavy calm, because that's what often comes right before a violent ending. By this point, Bonnie and Clyde have been running so long that normal life has stopped being a real memory and become more like a story they once heard about other people. Their world is reduced to essentials. A car, weapons, cash, a few trusted contacts, and the constant math of risk. Every decision is measured in seconds and miles. Every stop is a threat. Every new face is a possible betrayal. And the law that hunts them has evolved too. The pursuit is no longer fueled only by duty. It's fueled by accumulated deaths, wounded pride, and a determination that has hardened into a single goal. End it in a way that guarantees they can't escape again. Authorities understand something very simple about Clyde Barrow. He is not likely to surrender. He is not likely to freeze. He is not likely to politely step away from his vehicle with his hands up if he senses a trap. If he sees a badge, he sees handcuffs. If he sees handcuffs, he sees a cell. And if he sees a cell, he sees the destruction of everything he believes he is. That's why, in the final phase, law enforcement does not plan a conventional arrest. They plan a situation where response time is removed. A situation where the fugitives are forced into a narrow moment with no room to maneuver, no open road to burst onto, no chance to shoot their way into motion. This is where the final strategy locks into place. Use the gang's predictability against them. Instead of chasing them through endless counties, the hunters focus on what Bonnie and Clyde can't live without: trusted connections. The fugitives are exhausted, wounded, and psychologically cornered. They need familiar help. A friendly face, a safe stop, information about routes, a moment of rest without a stranger watching too closely. That need becomes the hook. And the hook becomes the trap. In their last days, Bonnie and Clyde move with the same compulsive urgency as always, but there's a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The road is no longer wide open, it feels watched. They stay alert, yet even alert people become predictable when their options are limited. They drive the same kinds of roads. They rely on the same small circle. They follow the same logic. Avoid cities, keep to rural routes, switch cars when necessary, use speed as protection, and keep weapons where the hands naturally fall. What makes the ending particularly grim is that there is no grand final robbery that crowns the spree. They don't die with bags of money and laughter. They die the way many fugitives die. Because every mile they travel narrows the odds, because every contact increases the risk of betrayal or surveillance, because every crime they committed has built a wall behind them they cannot climb back over. On the day of the ambush, the setting is almost painfully ordinary. A rural road. Trees and brush. A stretch of earth that looks like 1,000 other stretches across the south. It's the kind of place where, if you didn't know the history, you might drive through without remembering it. That ordinariness is part of the tactic. An ambush works best where the target feels comfortable enough to relax for half a second. Comfortable enough to not immediately suspect the air itself is a weapon. The posse chooses a place that serves their purpose. Limited escape routes, good cover, clear sight lines. They position themselves where they can hit the car quickly and decisively. The logic is harsh but clear. If they offer the fugitives time, they risk a shootout with officers dead. If they hesitate, Clyde might punch the accelerator, swing the wheel, and vanish into another string of stolen cars and bodies. So they build a plan that aims to end the story before it can become another chase. Bonnie and Clyde drive into that space the way they've driven into 1,000 spaces. With a criminal's alertness but also with the fatigue of people who have lived too long inside adrenaline. The car rolls forward. A moment happens, an instant where the future can still split into different paths. Then the ambush triggers and the world turns into noise. Gunfire erupts in a sudden, overwhelming burst. Not a single warning shot, not a patient negotiation. A storm of bullets intended to remove possibility. Glass shatters. Metal tears. The car becomes a cage. In that instant, every decision Bonnie and Clyde have made collapses into its final result. There is no time for an escape plan. No time for Clyde to reverse. No time for Bonnie to run. No time for a last romantic speech. The ending is fast, violent, and final, because the people waiting in the brush came to ensure there would be no second chance. When it's over, the silence that follows is not peaceful. It is the heavy silence of irreversible things. 2 bodies in a car on a rural road. 2 young lives ended in an eruption of consequences. And almost immediately, the modern era of their legend begins, because death doesn't stop a story like this, it transforms it. News spreads quickly. Photographs. Crowds. People who weren't there but want to be close to history. The scene becomes a magnet for curiosity, for morbid fascination, for the need to witness what the newspapers had been printing for months. In the aftermath, there's shock, relief, celebration in some corners, grief in others, and a tidal wave of storytelling that starts reshaping reality into myth. And here's the truth that sits underneath the legend. Bonnie and Clyde became symbols because America was desperate for symbols. In the Depression, people wanted villains to fear, wanted outlaws to admire, wanted stories to distract from hunger and uncertainty. Bonnie and Clyde fit the shape. Young, photogenic, reckless, in love, against the law. But the real story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a sequence of crimes that hurt ordinary people again and again. Car theft that stranded workers, robberies that traumatized clerks, kidnappings that left victims shaking for years, and killings that put officers into the ground. Their fame didn't erase the harm. It only made the harm louder. Their end, too, wasn't a romantic sacrifice. It was the result of a system adapting to a threat. It was the result of a manhunt hardened by blood. It was the final answer to Clyde's vow that he would never go back to prison. He didn't. But the price of that vow was that he and Bonnie never got to become anything else either. No second act. No quiet life. No old age. Just an ending on the road. And even after that last burst of gunfire, the story refused to die. Their names remained, printed and repeated, transformed into songs and films and posters, turned into a shorthand for outlaw romance. But if you strip away the cinematic glow and look at the raw spine of what happened, you see something much darker. 2 young people who mistook speed for freedom, who mistook notoriety for meaning, who mistook each other for an escape from a world that felt cruel, and who then built a life where the only possible ending was violence. Because that's the final, brutal mathematics of their spree. When your survival depends on crime, and your escape depends on intimidation, and your identity depends on never surrendering, the road eventually runs out. The map shrinks. The choices disappear. And one day, somewhere quiet and ordinary, the consequences arrive all at once.